In the winter-ravaged lands of Transylvania, in the year 1431, a child was born who would become one of history's most fearsome rulers. This was Vlad III, born in the fortified town of Sighișoara, where medieval buildings still stand today like a Bruegel painting come to life. The world he entered was one of perpetual conflict, where empires clashed and kingdoms rose and fell along the bloodied banks of the Danube River. To understand the man who would become Vlad the Impaler, we must first understand the precarious position of his homeland. Wallachia, now part of modern-day Romania, stood as the last independent European region south of Hungary, after the Ottoman Empire's relentless expansion. By 1431, the Turks had already conquered Serbia in 1389, Bulgaria in 1396, and would soon take Constantinople itself in 1453. This tiny Orthodox Christian nation found itself caught between two titans, the Catholic Kingdom of Hungary to the north and the Muslim Ottoman Empire pressing in from the south. The very geography of Wallachia shaped its destiny. The Carpathian Mountains formed its northern border, their forested hills rolling gently at first before rising dramatically eastward into the Fagaras Range, where more than a dozen rocky peaks soared above 8,000 feet. Between these mountains and the mighty Danube River lay a land that would become a battleground between east and west, between cross and crescent. The region's history was written in blood long before Vlad's birth. In 101 AD, the Roman Emperor Trajan conquered these lands, then known as Dacia, making it Rome's final territorial acquisition. But by 275 AD, Rome abandoned the province, pulling back to the more defensible Danube River line. The vacuum left behind drew waves of barbarian invasions, beginning with the Goths in 376 AD. For centuries afterward, the region was fought over by Bulgarians and Byzantines, then Bulgarians and Turks, while Hungary, Serbia, and Moldavia were torn apart by various invaders and armies. Vlad's father, Vlad II, lived in these turbulent times as ruler of Wallachia. His path to power was complex, marked by shifting alliances and political intrigue. In 1431, the same year his son was born, Vlad II was inducted into the Order of the Dragon in Nuremberg, a chivalric order charged with defending Christianity against its enemies, particularly the Ottoman Empire. From this membership, he gained the name Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Dragon, and his sons would become known as Dracula, meaning son of the dragon. The young Vlad III grew up with two brothers, Radu, his younger brother, and Vlad the monk, his half-brother from a different mother. He also had an older brother named Mircea, though their contact was limited. Their mother, Eupraxia, was herself of royal blood, descended from Moldavian nobility. But any semblance of a normal childhood would soon be shattered by the brutal realities of medieval politics. Their father, caught between Hungarian and Ottoman interests, was forced to play a dangerous game of shifting alliances. When Vlad II attended a diplomatic mission to the Ottoman capital to secure peace terms, he made a decision that would forever alter his young son's lives. The Sultan took Vlad III, then just 11 years old, and his brother Radu, only 6, as hostages to ensure their father's cooperation. Young Vlad found himself torn from everything he knew, imprisoned in a foreign land where his very survival depended on the political choices of a father hundreds of miles away. The Ottoman court would be his home for the next 5 years, a gilded cage where he received an education in science, language, philosophy, and the art of war. But it was also where he witnessed firsthand the Ottoman methods of punishment and torture, including the practice of impalement that would later become his trademark. The contrast between the brothers' reactions to their captivity would prove fateful. While Radu adapted to life in the Ottoman court, eventually converting to Islam and becoming a favorite of the future Sultan Mehmed II, Vlad remained defiantly insolent. Turkish accounts describe him as endlessly troublesome, subject to frequent whippings and fights with his guards. Even as he mastered their language and learned their ways of warfare, his hatred for his captors grew deeper with each passing day. Back in Wallachia, Vlad II's precarious position grew ever more dangerous. The Sultan demanded he join in raids against Transylvania, forcing him to attack fellow Christians. This action enraged John Hunyadi, the powerful Hungarian general who had once been Vlad II's ally. Meanwhile, the young Vlad III and his brother remained hostages in the Ottoman court, their lives hanging by a thread. Their father made a fateful choice. He would continue to aid Hunyadi against the Turks, effectively abandoning his sons to possible death. In a poignant letter to Transylvania, he wrote words that would haunt his son forever. "Please understand me. I have left my little children to be butchered for Christian peace, so that I and my country can be subjects of our king and join with you." The betrayal cut deep. Vlad II had sacrificed his younger sons in hopes of securing his royal line through his eldest, Mircea. It was a political calculation that would have devastating consequences. When Vlad II disappeared into Turkish territory and later returned to fight alongside Hunyadi, trust was irreparably broken. After a crushing defeat at the Battle of Varna in 1444, Wallachian soldiers helped Hunyadi escape back to their territory. There, in a twist of cruel irony, Vlad II and Mircea had him arrested, and at Mircea's urging, sentenced to death for his failure. Though Vlad II showed mercy and released Hunyadi, this act of clemency would prove to be his undoing. Hunyadi allied with the boyars, the powerful landed nobility of Wallachia, and orchestrated the murders of both Vlad II and Mircea. The manner of Mircea's death was particularly horrific. His eyes were burned out with hot pokers before being buried alive. All this occurred while young Vlad III remained a prisoner in Turkey, powerless to prevent the destruction of his family. This series of betrayals, by his father who abandoned him, by Hunyadi, who murdered his family, and by the boyars who aided in their deaths, would shape Vlad III's worldview and fuel his later acts of vengeance. But first, he had to survive his captivity. In 1448, after 5 years as a prisoner, Vlad III was finally released by the Turks. He was 17 years old, hardened by his experiences and burning with a desire for revenge. His brother Radu, however, chose to remain with the Ottomans, having found favour in their court. The stark difference in their paths would eventually pit brother against brother in a struggle for control of Wallachia. The Turks, hoping to install a loyal ruler in Wallachia, backed Vlad III's first attempt to claim his father's throne. It was a brief taste of power. He ruled for only 2 months before being overthrown. For the next several years, he moved between various courts, building alliances and waiting for his opportunity to return. He spent time in Moldavia with his uncle until the latter's assassination, then fled to various locations across the Holy Roman Empire and Hungary. Finally, in 1456, at the age of 25, Vlad III made his decisive move to reclaim the throne of Wallachia. According to chronicles of the time, he faced his predecessor, Vladislav II, in single combat, defeating him personally before taking control of the country. This display of martial prowess would become characteristic of his rule. Vlad was always at the forefront of battle, leading his men from the vanguard rather than commanding from the rear. Once in power, Vlad moved swiftly to consolidate his authority and exact revenge on those who had betrayed his family. His first target would be the boyars, those nobles who had conspired in his father's death. On Easter Sunday, he called them to a great feast at his residence in Targovište. 500 people attended, lords and their wives, some from families that predated the formation of Wallachia itself. The Easter feast began with an air of celebration, wine flowing freely, as the nobles relaxed in the presence of their young ruler. But Vlad had carefully orchestrated every detail of what would become one of history's most infamous banquets. As the evening wore on, he called for silence and began questioning his guests. "How many voivodes have you seen in your lives?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken menace. After a confused silence, one elder spoke up, claiming to have seen 30 rulers come and go. Vlad moved around the room, asking young and old alike. 7, said one younger boyar. Dozens, claimed another. Some admitted they had lost count. One elderly noble even dared to reference Vlad's ancestors, mentioning that since his grandfather's time, he had seen no less than 20 voivodes. While the nobles gave their answers, Vlad's men were quietly barring the doors from the outside. What happened next would become the stuff of legend. His soldiers moved swiftly through the hall, seizing the nobles. Those who resisted were quickly subdued. Vlad divided his captives into 2 groups, those young and strong enough for labor, and those too old or infirm to work. The younger nobles were marched 50 miles away to the ruins of his castle at Poenari, where they would be forced to rebuild it, stone by stone. The elderly nobles and their families met a more gruesome fate. They were impaled on stakes outside his residence, their bodies left to rot and feed the vultures. These victims became the first additions to what would become known as Vlad's Forest of the Impaled. Sometime around this massacre, Vlad ordered his brother Mircea's body to be exhumed. The position of the corpse, buried face down, confirmed his worst fears. His beloved brother had indeed been buried alive. This discovery only fueled his thirst for vengeance. Many boyars who survived the initial purge fled north, seeking refuge in the Saxon towns of Transylvania. These were not ordinary villages, but wealthy trading communities established by German settlers who had been arriving since the 12th century. The Transylvanian Saxons had built a network of fortified towns and had close ties to the boyars through trade and political alliances. Vlad knew he could not allow these potential threats to gather strength beyond his borders. In 1457, he launched his first attack against the Transylvanian town of Sibiu, where his brother Vlad the Monk resided, another potential rival for the throne. Vlad rode at the head of his army, reportedly numbering 20,000 men, though this figure is likely exaggerated, burning and impaling as he went. These raids were only the beginning. In 1459, Vlad launched a sustained campaign of terror across southern Transylvania, targeting the Saxon towns of Brasov, Amlash, and Fogarash. His army descended from the Carpathian passes like an avenging force, burning crops, capturing civilians, and conducting mass executions. At Brasov, he rode as far as the Chapel of St. Jacob, ordering the suburbs burned and the population impaled at the foot of the mountains. Ever theatrical in his cruelty, Vlad set up a table among his dying victims and ate his breakfast while they suffered. His methods grew increasingly elaborate. In Amlash, he had people shredded like cabbage with swords and knives. He ordered the construction of a large copper cauldron with a wooden lid pierced with holes. Victims were placed inside, their heads forced through the holes, and then boiled alive. From Fogarash, he took men, women, and children back to Wallachia for impalement. The numbers given in contemporary accounts are staggering. 30,000 said to have been killed in Amlash alone, though the town's total population couldn't have supported such figures. Other accounts speak of 300 children of fled parents being burned or impaled. While these numbers are likely exaggerated, the brutality of the acts themselves is well documented. While Vlad terrorized the countryside, he also implemented strict and often lethal trade policies. The Transylvanian Saxons had grown wealthy through trade with Constantinople and the Turks, using Wallachia as their corridor to the east. They were accustomed to writing their own trade agreements and operating with considerable freedom within Wallachian territory. Vlad changed all that. He strictly limited where and when merchants could sell their goods during bazaars. When merchants, faced with having to trek back across the mountains without selling all their wares, continued to operate outside designated areas and times, Vlad had them executed and impaled. He would then confiscate their wealth, using it to pay his growing army of loyal followers, many of whom were peasants he had freed from boyar control. One particularly telling story involved a merchant who came to Wallachia with a cart full of valuable goods. Concerned about thieves, the merchant sought an audience with Vlad himself to ask where he might safely store his wares overnight. Vlad assured him that his kingdom was completely safe, telling him to leave everything in the middle of the town square without any guards. The merchant, though skeptical, had no choice but to comply. The next morning, the merchant returned to find everything exactly as he had left it, except for one bag of gold that had mysteriously disappeared. Vlad immediately called for a search of the town. When the thief was found, he was promptly impaled in the town square. But Vlad wasn't finished. He presented the merchant with a new bag of gold, one containing an extra coin, and insisted the merchant count it. When the merchant found the extra coin and reported it, Vlad nodded approvingly. Had the merchant kept quiet about the extra coin, he too would have been impaled as a thief. Even religious figures weren't safe from Vlad's brutal justice. When some monks from a nearby monastery visited his castle, one had the misfortune of gagging at the smell of decomposing bodies impaled along the road. Vlad asked if anything was wrong, and the foolish monk complained about the offensive odor, requesting they speak elsewhere. In response, Vlad had him impaled on an extra tall stake, saying he would now be high enough above the other corpses to catch a breath of fresh air and be free of the stink. But it was Vlad's treatment of Ottoman envoys that would finally provoke open war with the Turks. In 1459, he ceased paying tribute to the Ottoman Empire, tribute that included not just money, but also livestock, grain, and young boys to be raised as soldiers in their Janissary army. The Sultan sent 2 envoys to discuss the matter. When they appeared before Vlad and refused to remove their turbans, citing religious custom, Vlad declared he would help them better observe their tradition by having their turbans nailed to their heads with iron spikes. This was not the final straw, however. The Sultan tried once more at diplomacy, sending a learned Greek scholar known for his powers of persuasion, along with promises of riches and rewards. This was part of a plot coordinated with Hamza Beg, governor of Nicopolis, to capture Vlad when he agreed to travel to Constantinople. But Vlad saw through the ruse. He agreed to accompany them, then sprung his own trap. Before the Sultan's trap could be sprung, Vlad took the Greek scholar and his entourage prisoner. When Hamza Beg's forces attacked, they found themselves surrounded by Vlad's secret guard, who had been shadowing the party from a distance. All the Turks, around 1,000 men, were captured and marched back to Targovishte. But Vlad wasn't finished. Displaying the cunning he'd learned during his years of captivity, he approached the fortress of Giurgiu on the Danube, dressed in Turkish garb. Speaking perfect Turkish, a skill acquired during his imprisonment, he called out to the guards, announcing himself and demanding they open the gates to prepare for passage to the capital. Once inside, Vlad and his men attacked, killing the entire garrison and setting the fortress ablaze. Hamza Beg, the Greek scholar, and their Turkish soldiers were added to Vlad's growing forest of the Impaled. Then, in an audacious move that would shock even his enemies, Vlad crossed the Danube into Ottoman territory. He carved a path of destruction across the Izru region and along the southern banks of the Danube, all the way to the Black Sea. Every settlement, port, stronghold, and city in his path was sacked and burned. He killed indiscriminately soldiers, civilians, Turks, Bulgarians, men, women, elderly, and children alike. In a letter to the Hungarian emperor, Vlad boasted of killing over 20,000 Turks, declaring, "I have broken the peace." With this ominous announcement, he sent a bag containing Turkish heads, noses, and ears. When he reached the Danube Delta at the Black Sea, Ottoman flotillas were already sailing upriver to launch their counterattack. The Sultan himself, Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, would lead the invasion force. Knowing the Turks would march on Targovishte, Vlad rode back to Wallachia to prepare. But his preparations were not defensive. They were devastatingly tactical. He implemented a scorched earth policy, poisoning wells across the entire region between Vidin and Targovishte. He burned crops in the fields, evacuated the entire population, and hid his people and livestock in the marshes, forests, and mountains. Any animals they couldn't take with them were butchered, and left to rot in the sun, creating a wasteland for the advancing Ottoman army. In June 1462, Vlad made his boldest move yet. Despite being vastly outnumbered, his force of roughly 30,000 men faced a Turkish army estimated between 60,000 and 200,000 strong. He launched a frontal assault on the Ottoman forces at Vidin as they attempted to cross the Danube. The crossing was a vulnerable moment for the Turks, as ships could only transport troops a few at a time, leaving them exposed during disembarkation. Vlad's forces, riding on horse-drawn carriages, turned their cannons sideways to fire at the masses of Turkish troops. While this was a disadvantageous way to use artillery, it allowed the more mobile Wallachians to target the concentrated Turkish forces more effectively than the Ottoman cannons could hit their smaller, moving targets. However, this advantage was short-lived. The Turks quickly adapted, digging trenches and erecting defensive positions with pikes to repel Vlad's cavalry charges. They positioned their superior cannons within these fortifications, making any further frontal assault suicidal. Though chronicles claim Vlad's forces managed to slay 300 Turks that day, he was forced to retreat into the dense old-growth oak forests that were nearly impossible for outsiders to navigate on horseback. The Ottoman advance became painfully slow. Following standard military practice dating back to Roman times, they had to recreate their defensive stronghold each night, digging trenches, positioning pikes and cannon. This exhausting routine, combined with the lack of food and water from Vlad's scorched earth tactics, began to wear on the massive army. Any expeditionary forces sent out to search for supplies or to hunt down Vlad's forces never returned. The Wallachians knew these forests intimately and killed any Turkish scouts to the last man. On June 17th, 1462, Vlad made what military tacticians of the time considered an act of desperation, a night attack. No serious military commander would typically attempt such a risky maneuver, but Vlad had no interest in a war of attrition he couldn't win. His only hope was to kill Sultan Mehmed II himself, and darkness provided his only chance. A Serbian chronicler within the Turkish camp left a detailed account of that fateful night. The usual evening routine was underway. The clatter of pots and pans being cleaned after dinner, guards pacing their rounds, soldiers chatting quietly as they prepared for sleep. Many complained of unrelenting thirst from days without adequate water. Then, through the darkness came the hoot of an owl, followed by another, Vlad's signal to attack. Chaos erupted instantly. The Wallachians rode into the edges of camp, cutting down soldiers at random before anyone realized what was happening. Soon, riders carrying torches appeared, weaving through the camp without attacking. Horns began to sound. They were signaling to each other, seeking the Sultan's tent. In their haste, however, they targeted the wrong one. They destroyed it completely, killing the guards and 2 military viziers inside. But this crucial mistake cost them their primary objective. By the time Vlad realized their error, the real Sultan's tent was surrounded by a thick formation of Turkish troops, with pikes bristling outward and archers firing volleys of arrows. The Wallachians could never break through, and the Turks wisely maintained their defensive position rather than risk the Sultan's safety by pursuing the attackers. Some accounts claim Vlad had arranged for a boyar to attack from the opposite side in a pincer movement, but no other forces appeared that night. In the final hours before dawn, the Wallachians, unable to reach their primary target, began savagely butchering the Turks' pack animals. A strategic move to hinder their ability to march, but also perhaps an expression of pure frustration at their failed assassination attempt. The casualties of this night raid are disputed. Some chroniclers claim minimal losses on both sides, while others report 5,000 to 7,000 Wallachian cavalry and 15,000 Turkish soldiers killed. The lower estimates are likely more accurate, as such devastating losses to Vlad's cavalry force would have effectively ended his ability to resist. As the Turks continued their advance toward Targovishte, they encountered Vlad's most infamous creation, the Forest of the Impaled. Stretching for 2 miles long and 1 mile wide in a crescent Around the city, an estimated 20,000 corpses hung suspended on stakes. The victims were in various stages of decomposition, creating a scene of unspeakable horror. Skeletons picked clean by carrion birds stood alongside more recent victims, their flesh hanging in strips, bones partially exposed. Some poles were empty, their ghastly burdens having completely rotted away. The details reported by witnesses were nightmarish. Mothers had been impaled beneath their babies on the same pike. Women's breasts had been carved away, their infants stuffed into the cavities of their chests. Birds had made nests in the hollow thoraxes of corpses. Vultures feasted on exposed faces while the summer heat intensified the overwhelming stench of decay. For the Turkish soldiers, already weakened by weeks of thirst, hunger, and constant harassment, this horrific spectacle proved too much. Many doubled over retching, their empty stomachs convulsing at the sight and smell. The psychological impact of the Forest of the Impaled was devastating. The Sultan, who had conquered Constantinople itself less than a decade earlier, ordered a retreat. While some historians argue this withdrawal was more due to practical considerations, lack of supplies, difficult terrain, and constant guerrilla attacks, than the horror of Vlad's display, the Forest of the Impaled had certainly achieved its intended effect. However, the Sultan had one final card to play. He left behind Vlad's younger brother Radu with a contingent of troops and substantial financial resources. Radu, who had spent 15 years in Ottoman captivity and had reportedly become the Sultan's lover, was completely loyal to the Turkish cause. He approached the Wallachian boyars with an offer. If they supported him as voivode instead of his brother, they would have peace with the Ottomans and an end to the constant warfare and atrocities. The exhausted and terrified populace proved receptive to Radu's offer. Vlad's support began to crumble as his people, weary of constant warfare and brutal executions, shifted their allegiance to his brother. Forced to flee, Vlad sought refuge in Transylvania, where he hoped to receive aid from Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary. It was a fatal miscalculation. Instead of offering support, Corvinus had Vlad arrested and imprisoned at Visegrad. This shocking betrayal had complex motivations. Officially, Corvinus claimed to have intercepted letters showing Vlad intended to betray Christendom to the Turks in exchange for the Wallachian throne, though these documents were likely forged. The real reason may have been more pragmatic. Corvinus had received money from Pope Pius II to fund a crusade to help Vlad, but had spent it on himself instead. By imprisoning Vlad, he could justify his actions to the Pope, while avoiding immediate conflict with the Ottomans. During his imprisonment, which lasted 13 years, stories circulated that Vlad maintained his appetite for cruelty by capturing birds and mice and impaling them on tiny stakes. Whether true or merely propaganda, such tales added to his growing legend. German pamphlets began circulating throughout Europe, describing his atrocities in graphic detail. These accounts, while likely exaggerated, helped cement his reputation as one of history's most brutal rulers. In 1475, after years of captivity, Vlad was finally released. He was now around 44 years old, and his brother Radu had recently died, possibly murdered, though not by Vlad's hand. With Hungarian backing, he made one final bid for the Wallachian throne. The details of his last campaign are unclear, but we know he achieved some victories against Ottoman forces in Bosnia and Serbia in early 1476. By August, he had driven the Turks from Moldavia entirely. On November 26, 1476, Vlad was crowned voivode of Wallachia for the third time. But his final reign would be brutally short. Within months, he was dead, though accounts of his demise vary. Some say he was betrayed by his mercenary bodyguards, who had been bribed by his enemies. Others claim he was killed by his own troops after disguising himself as a Turk, a tactic that had served him well in the past, but ultimately proved fatal. What is known with certainty is that he was beheaded, and his head was sent to Constantinople as proof of his death, displayed on a spike much like the countless victims of his own preferred method of execution. Vlad's legacy would live on long after his death, taking on dimensions he could never have imagined. In the immediate aftermath, accounts of his brutality spread through the newly invented printing press, becoming some of the first horror bestsellers in European history. The German pamphlets, complete with woodcut illustrations, depicted scenes of unimaginable cruelty, people being boiled alive, roasted, flayed, and most notably, impaled. Some accounts claimed he forced parents to eat their children, had husbands eat their wives' breasts, and built secret trapdoors that dropped victims onto strategically placed stakes below. Yet in his homeland, a very different picture emerged. To many Romanians, Vlad was seen as a hero who had defended their land against Ottoman invasion and maintained order through harsh but necessary justice. His brutal methods were viewed in the context of an equally brutal age, where such violence was commonplace among rulers. He had stood against the Ottoman Empire when most Christian rulers were either ignoring or placating the Turks, and he had succeeded, however briefly, in maintaining his country's independence. This complex legacy would take on new life in the 1890s, when an Irish theatre manager named Bram Stoker visited the coastal town of Whitby, England. In the local library, which would later become a chip shop, Stoker discovered a book by an obscure English diplomat about the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. Around page 19, a footnote caught his attention. In the local language, Dracula meant devil, a nickname given to particularly fearsome or cunning rulers. Prior to this discovery, Stoker had been working on a vampire novel with the rather underwhelming title Count Vampire. The name Dracula and the region of Transylvania, which translates as the land beyond the forests, provided the perfect Gothic atmosphere for his tale. While Stoker's Count Dracula shared little with the historical Vlad beyond the name, certain elements of the real prince's life found their way into the novel. Descriptions of commanding armies against the Turks, the burial and exhumation of bodies, and distant memories of great battles fought by a once noble line. The real Vlad left a legacy as complex as the man himself. He was a product of his time and circumstances, abandoned by his father, imprisoned by his enemies, and forced to fight for survival in a land caught between empires. His methods were undeniably brutal, yet they arose from a world where violence was a common language of power. Some historians view him as a cunning Machiavellian ruler who used intimidation and violence as tools of political negotiation. Others see him as simply bloodthirsty, taking pleasure in cruelty for its own sake. Perhaps he was something else entirely, a man shaped by betrayal and survival, who used his position to amass a following and take revenge on his enemies while enriching himself and his supporters. His popularity among peasants, whom he freed from boyar control and enriched through confiscated wealth, suggests a ruler who understood the power of loyalty bought with blood and gold. Historians continue to debate whether the failed Turkish invasion of Wallachia was truly repelled by Vlad's tactics, or if it was part of a more complex political strategy. Some argue that the Turks, despite having their sultan present and overwhelming numerical superiority, never intended to conquer and occupy Wallachia. Their true goal, according to this theory, was to replace Vlad with his more compliant brother Radu, a goal they ultimately achieved. Yet this interpretation seems at odds with the massive scale of the invasion and the presence of Mehmed II himself. The castle Vlad built at Poenari, using the forced labour of the boyars' families, fell into such obscurity after his death that people forgot he had ever lived there. Like the legendary city of Troy, historians had to rediscover its location by questioning locals. What they found atop a steep, remote foothill in the Carpathians was little more than a foundation and a ruined wall, further damaged by earthquakes over the centuries. The 1,000 steps leading up the mountain stand as a testament to the brutal labour that went into its construction. Between his two wives, Vlad had 5 children, but only one followed in his bloody footsteps, his son Minya, who proved just as brutal as his father, but held power only briefly. All of Vlad's direct and indirect descendants were dead by the end of the 1600s. Some historians believe Elizabeth Bathory, the infamous Blood Countess, was distantly related to Vlad through Hungarian nobility, though this connection remains speculative. Vlad's actual burial place remains a matter of debate. Some sources claim he was interred in a monastery church on the northern edge of modern-day Bucharest, as was tradition for rulers of his time. However, no tomb has been found there, leading others to suggest he might be buried in a different monastery between Bucharest and the Danube, closer to where he met his end. The story of Vlad the Impaler reveals a man who seemed to emerge from a darker, more violent age, unsuited for the diplomatic necessities of his time. In an era when European politics increasingly required negotiation and alliance building, Vlad relied on strength and military prowess alone. He was a warrior in an age that increasingly demanded politicians. His inability, or unwillingness, to adapt to these changing requirements ultimately contributed to his downfall. His estimated toll of 80,000 victims included nobles, merchants, Ottoman soldiers, and common people alike. While some of the more lurid accounts of his atrocities may be exaggerated, the core of his brutality is well documented through multiple sources, including his own writings. In one letter, he coldly catalogued his kills. "I have killed peasants, men and women, old and young. Where the Danube flows into the sea up to Rahova, we killed 23,884 Turks, without counting those whom we burned in homes or whose heads were cut by our soldiers." In Romania today, Vlad remains a controversial figure, a national hero to some, a bloodthirsty tyrant to others. His methods were undeniably brutal, yet they arose in response to brutal times. He defended his homeland against overwhelming odds, maintained independence through sheer force of will, and left an indelible mark on history. Through Bram Stoker's novel, his name would become immortal, though in a form he could never have imagined. The real Vlad Dracula proved more complex, more human, and in many ways more terrifying than any fictional vampire. The original manuscript of Dracula, discovered decades later in a Pennsylvania barn and eventually purchased by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, contained a curious preface that was removed before publication in 1897. In this preface, Stoker wrote, "I am quite convinced that there is no doubt whatever that the events here described really took place, however unbelievable and incomprehensible they might appear at first sight. And I am further convinced that they must always remain to some extent incomprehensible." The publisher insisted on removing these lines and presenting the work as pure fiction, partly due to fears of causing panic in England, which was still reeling from the unsolved Jack the Ripper murders of the late 1880s. The name Dracula itself has complex origins rooted in the Order of the Dragon. In Romanian, the word Dracul carries a dual meaning. It can mean both dragon and devil. Vlad's father earned the name Vlad Dracul through his membership in the Order, making his son Dracula, literally son of the dragon, though it could also be interpreted as son of the devil. This dual meaning would prove prophetic in the creation of Stoker's vampire count. While Stoker's Count Dracula bears little physical resemblance to the historical Vlad, echoes of the real prince's life appear throughout the novel. The Count speaks of commanding armies against the Turks, and the novel includes the themes of buried treasure, possibly inspired by stories of Vlad confiscating wealth from merchants. Some Romanian traditions even connected Vlad to the supernatural, depicting him battling not only the Ottoman Empire, but also the Strigoi, or living vampires, as opposed to the undead. The novel's publication created an unexpected cultural clash. While Dracula became a worldwide sensation, many Romanians were offended by the transformation of their national hero into a supernatural monster. To them, Vlad was a defender of Christian Europe against Ottoman expansion, a harsh but necessary ruler who maintained order through strict justice. The Vampire Association struck them as an insult to his memory, akin to foreign tourists asking where Churchill, the great ghoul, had lived. Today, Vlad's legacy exists in this curious duality: historical warrior prince and fictional vampire lord. His real castle at Poianari lies in ruins, while tourists flock to Bran Castle, which has only tenuous historical connections to Vlad, but has become known as Dracula's castle through clever marketing. The ruthless prince who impaled his enemies has become immortal in a way he could never have imagined, transformed by literature into an undead count who feeds on blood rather than inspiring terror through violence. Yet perhaps there is a fitting symmetry in this transformation. Both the historical Vlad and Stoker's Count Dracula are creatures of the frontier, defending their lands against foreign incursion. Both inspire terror through their methods, though one preferred wooden stakes while the other feared them. And both remain compelling figures who continue to captivate audiences centuries after their creation. Their stories blend in history and myth into something larger than either.